This is a kind of an unusual thing for me, but recently I felt sad when I heard about the divorce of Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie. Usually, to me, it's fluff, and I just ignore it because, this is the fluff of life. And you need candy, you need sweets, but not too much of it, right? Anyway, and I'll tell you why I felt sad for them in particular. Sure, they are attractive. Sure, they're glamorous. Sure, they got lots of money. They have a lot of power. Everything that people would want, they have, right? But I appreciate the fact that, they've tried to do something more. They've tried to take care of the poor. They've been concerned for the difficulties of some of the nations in Africa, and they've adopted children from all over the world. And that's very different. I thought about it, what could cause a couple like them? Not particularly them, because I have no idea. I wouldn't want to presume to speak. Okay? But a couple who has so much to end up being divorced. Because when they began, as I read the article a little bit, you're reminded that Brad Pitt was married to Jennifer Aniston, okay, from, I was going to say Cheers, from Friend, thank you. And anyway, and they fell passionately in love. And I wondered if all those causes and all those other things that were part of their identity didn't start to bury that love and passion they had. Because it's possible. When I was a young guy, just getting into my teens, because I grew up all by myself and didn't have any sisters around, and my parents worked. But I knew that someday I wanted to get married and have a family. So I says, you know what? I need to learn about women. Couldn't learn it at home, right? So being the nerd that I am and believing and having the philosophy that anything worth doing is worth doing well, I go and get a book. So I picked up, and back in those days, there weren't too many books, especially Christian books, about the subject. But this pastor had written these two books. One was called Letters to Philip. The other one was called Letters to Karen. And the subtitle of Letters to Philip was on how to treat a woman. And I said, this is what I need, And I read that book, and it was great. I mean, you talk about starting from zero. Well, I was probably minus 10, so I had a long ways to go. And one of the stories he told in that book was about a guy and in a marriage. And this guy was a good guy, but he couldn't keep a job. So always the household and finances were all taken care of by the woman's job, by her work. And so what happened was this, though. They had a wonderful marriage. And one day the pastor says, what is it? You guys are so loving toward each other. And then the wife says, Pastor, I know a lot of guys look down on my husband because he can't keep a job. And a lot of women feel pity for me. And I work hard, but you know what? I don't mind. Because even though my husband doesn't have much money, every day he has a special expression of his love for me. He could go to the local drugstore and come back with my favorite candy bar. Okay? He could pick some flowers and he could arrange them for me on the table. And she says, you know what? I know I'm at the center of his life. And he loves me, and that's what really matters. See, and I thought of that story when I thought about what could happen to a couple like Brad and Angelina. That you could lose along the way the core thing, the most important thing in life. And that's kind of like what this passage and what Paul is trying to talk about. The title of today's sermon is Summum Bonum. Some of you Italians out there, you know what that means? Okay, I learned this a long time ago. This was a philosophical idea. Excuse my allergies affecting my voice. But and this was something philosophers were seeking after, because summum bonum means the highest good. That in life we are to seek the highest good. So they were in their quest of it. And so I call this the highest good, because what Paul is going to contrast is spiritual gifts. And he starts off in chapter 13 talking about the tongues of men and of angels. He talks about prophetic powers. He talks about understanding all mysteries and having the gift of knowledge. He talks about faith that cannot just move mountains. Did you realize that word was remove mountains? Okay, I don't know how you do that. Throw it in the ocean, whatever. He's talking about giving his body. You're talking about, man, those spectacular spiritual gifts. He says, guess what? I am going to contrast that. After he said in chapter 12, verse 31, he says, desire the better gifts. Okay? But then he says, but I want you to think of something even better. In fact, the Greek is beyond compare. And he calls it a better way. And it's the way of love. And I like that he did that, because they're not mutually exclusive. But the problem is, you could be so busy using your gifts that you forget about the love and you leave it behind. And you could be doing wonderful things for the Lord using your gifts and say, look at me, me, me. Right? And you forgot about the love, because it's purpose of the gifts, him, him, him. Not me, me, me. And that's been kind of the problem with the whole discussion of spiritual gifts, and especially these. And so that's kind of what we're talking about. That the way of love is most highly prized, that spiritual gifts can't even hold a candle up to it. And so this is the highest good, the supreme love of God. And when we are privileged to experience it, it's our duty to shine a light on it through our lives so that they will see it through us. We are to be God's best advertisement for His love. And the possibility of forgetting that emphasis is laid out for us when Jesus rebuked the church of Ephesus in Revelation chapter 2. And I want us to take a look at that verse in verse 4. And he's talking to the churches, representative and particular churches in Asia. And he's listing all of their good points and all of their bad points. One church only had bad points. But he starts off with the church of Ephesus, which had many good points. And then it makes a U-turn at verse 4. But I have this against you, that you have abandoned the love you had at first. You see? You've given up the way of love. And God says that is not only bad, that is a dangerous thing. And so we are to learn not to have to do that. And in Revelation, he's picking on the Ephesians church because it's a representative church. But God could have been exactly saying the same thing to the Corinthian congregation. And so Paul is trying to help get them on track. Remember Sears? Sears was once the preeminent company of the United States. In fact, they were Amazon before Amazon. Did you ever think of that? You got this catalog you ordered and it came in the mail. That's Amazon. Okay, except now we're doing it electronically. But you know what? They got big. And they want to be bigger. And so they started offering financial services and insurance, and they diversified, because that's the American way. Diverse and control everything. And they lost their core purpose. And now they're struggling to find where they're going to go. And I can tell you company after company that started small, doing one particular thing so well that everybody was left behind and made them very successful, and then boom, they get big and they lose their emphasis. They buy things totally outside of their expertise. And that's a sure recipe for destruction. So it happens. This is a general situation when you lose those things that are core. And so for the Christian to lose the core is a very dangerous thing. And it's not just for Christians, but in the topic of love, losing our core, losing the love can often be dangerous. Over and over again in movies, in stories, and books, you find this theme being played out. Some of you saw the Robin Williams version of the Peter Pan story. I think that was the one called Hook. And Robin Williams played the father who was so busy, right? So busy amassing and providing for his family that he kept missing his son's activities. And you know what? What did his son want? Did he want the new bike? Did he want the Nintendo? Did he want all these lavish things? No. The son wanted his father's attention and love. Last night, like I said, the two Randys told us of how, even though their fathers were not perfect provider, and it sounded like Randy Severino, while he was sharing, realized anew how poor his family was when he was growing up, right? And he was talking about his hippie parents and the way they behaved. But you know what? He learned from his father his passion for drumming, for auto mechanics, all of this stuff. And so 29 years later, after his father is gone, he talks about it and he still got emotional. That's the kind of imprint when even love in the simplest form transmitted to us impacts us, shapes us, and makes us who we are. And so the father is so busy out there working so hard, he loses connection with the family, and he thinks by substituting goods, products, provisions, that's going to do it. And he discovers, to his dismay, that he's lost his household. And I can repeat this story because you hear about it between husbands and wives, between spouses. You hear that about pastors and their churches. Okay? A very famous pastor in Southern California, if I mentioned his name, you'd all know about it. And he got so famous and he spent so much time on TV and writing books that when he left, the congregation declared, "We do not want this kind of a pastor. We want a pastor who's going to do visitation." Problem was, his church was probably 8,000 by that point. But that's what happens. We can all lose our way. So Paul is saying, going back to the passage now, but just showing you the impact and the relevance, okay, that the Corinthians had lost their way. And this has always been a problem. So many things in life are so attractive, so spectacular. When Paul wrote to the Roman church, he warned them the same thing. He says in Romans 12:3, just before he started to list the spiritual gifts, he says, "For by the grace given to me, I say to everyone among you, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think with sober judgment." And the sober judgment that he's talking about, that he mentions in Corinthians as, what do you have that wasn't provided by the Father above? So why are you so proud? God gave it to you, is what he's saying. And he said the same thing to the Ephesians when he talked about spiritual gifts. He says, listen, this is for building unity. And what had happened with the Corinthians is they had come to use it for competition, for envy, and for belittling the little guy. And so Paul has to spend 3 chapters with the Corinthians to try to correct this. 12, 13, and 14. And he has to say things like, the body has many members, and every part of it is necessary. So I don't want the foot saying to the hand, I'm less than you. And I don't want the hand saying to the foot that I'm more valuable. You know that little game? If you had to lose 1 cent, what would it be? Paul says, none of them. God need them all. But God can turn the ones you have left and you make them into something more valuable. And so he's over there and he's telling them to get rid of their pride and stop using it. Because that was kind of the theme of the culture of the Corinthian church. That they took pride in all kinds of things. From the opening chapters, Paul has to shut them down and say, quit saying which pastor or preacher is your favorite, to the point of where you guys are fighting with each other. Some of you say, I love Peter because he's passionate. I love Apollos because he's so eloquent. I love Paul because he's so theologically altogether. He said, no. And you know, it's true. Because there's so many different types of us that we need all of them. That's why we tell teachers, don't use the same teaching method all the time, but use a variety of methods, because not everybody in your class learns the same way. And so to reach all of them, you've got to use a variety. And so, and Paul is basically telling them, whatever's your best gift, even if you used it in its most spectacular effectiveness, it doesn't match with this thing that you can't compare, that exists qualitatively on an entirely higher level, which is what? The way of love. Yeah, the way of love. And you need to bring in love so that it's always a part of who you are and how you are. And so I love the way Paul does it. He sets a standard and he becomes a model. Now, a lot of times, if a pastor were to say that to you or a superior and they were telling you, I want you to express the way of love, you know, you're stunned. But you see how Paul does it in chapter 13, verses 1 to 3. He says, if I speak with tongues, if I have this kind of faith, and he doesn't put it on them. He's saying, if this were me and I didn't have love, my total value is what? 0. I'm nothing. You see how diplomatically and how lovingly and how consistent he is when he's talking about love. Okay? And that's where I really have to work hard to check myself. That anything that I talk about, even though I know it, first then I have to get to be conscious in doing it, so that someday I can unconsciously and naturally do it, because it's become so much a part of my character. And so Paul is guiding them in a most wonderful way. And this is part of a larger principle that I want to draw your attention to. This is kind of an application of a larger principle that God gives us in the Bible. Turn to Matthew chapter 6. We're in the Sermon on the Mount. And in the Sermon on the Mount, in chapter 6, In different words, the same concept is coming across. Beware of practicing your righteousness before other people in order to be seen by them, for then, guess what? You will have no reward from your Father who is in heaven. Okay? So, hey, everybody in church may think you're so great. But eternal net worth, on that score, 0. Okay? And then he's talking about giving. First he talked about righteousness. Now he talks about giving. And he says, sound, verse 2, sound no trumpet before you as the hypocrites do. Okay, so that they can be praised because what? They have received your reward. Okay, if you're doing it for the people that can see you, great. You've succeeded. I don't need to give you a pat on the back, God says. And so he says that over and over. Next, he comes to prayer and not praying in order to be seen. He says, you know what? Your Father who is in secret will reward you in secret. And he just goes on, and he comes finally down in verse 16 about fasting. See, these are all great Christian things. We're not just talking about spiritual gifts, but remember our purposes. Remember who's supposed to get the glory. Remember who we're doing it for. And it's never for ourselves. And this all comes together in Romans 14:16, where it says, so do not let what you regard as good be spoken of as evil. Or I like the King James, let not your good be evil spoken of. Okay, you got to kind of unmix the words a little bit when you read the King James. But he's saying you could be doing something perfectly good, but it can turn out to be something that has negative or ill or evil effects if you don't keep track of your purposes, if you can't keep track of God's core values. And so if you're speaking in tongues, because there is a gift of interpretation, if you're alone, speak it all you want. But if you're in a congregational setting, you speak it, there's nobody there to interpret, everybody is out in the code. They're listening to you, but they don't know what's going on. Okay? It's like whenever you're in a service and you don't understand what's going on, because like me, you can't hear, or you don't understand the language, you pray, right? You do something to compensate. Well, he said, if you have somebody speaking in tongues, pause, let the person interpret, everybody be blessed, then say something else. And then let it be interpreted. And if there isn't no one, then you save it for at home. And that's how you would bring the way of love into the practice of spiritual gifts so that your good doesn't become a source of division and separation. We've done this in the home. We've talked about it. We've talked about how we can do it in the church. Reviewing church history, it's always been an issue. That whether it's about church worship and liturgy, whether it's about preaching style, about how we do our evangelism, or how we even handle doctrine, you can get so much caught up in that application that you lose the way of love. I went to a seminary where we loved to debate one another, okay? And you had those who held the majority view, you had those who held the minority view. And the minority view did not feel a part of the community because rather than it just being a debate, it became something totally negative. They felt attacked and persecuted. They felt second class. That's not what you want in a seminary. And that's not what you want when you are talking about doctrine. I have a little book called Letters to Young Calvinists. My seminary was a Calvinist seminary. And in writing to a young Calvinist, he sends a bunch of letters. And letter number 2 is about religious pride. And he talks about, yeah, you love what you're learning, but don't look down on the people who haven't learned it or who don't agree with it. Don't use it as a point of attacking and correcting and making them feel inferior. He says, now is a good time as any to warn you about one of the foremost temptations that accompanies Reformed theology, pride. And then he goes on, and I'm going to cut it short. And so we have to worry about it all the time because it's always crouching there, taking advantage of what we call zeal. So we know, Paul says, yes, there's many good things in life. There are some great things in life. But the highest good is love. This is why it's called the Great Commandment. Love God and express it by loving everyone. And I like how Mark prayed, even our enemies. I love the blue states. I love the red states. Okay? I would never deride. I may disagree with the candidate, but I would never deride their base because they are choosing those values out of very real needs. Right? And that's how you look at it with love. So here's what we can do. All of us have relationships, family relationships, work relationships, neighborhood relationships, all of these. I recommend doing a love audit. Sound good? A love audit. That should sound good, okay? Am I loving these people in the way that should be loved? Okay? The way I interact with them, does my love show? Not only is it my main purpose, but does it show in the way you do it? Guy, you ever have your wife mad at you? And she cooks a swell meal, but she throws it on the table at you, and you feel miserable with each bite? You know, that was love without love. And it just made you feel miserable. You see, so is that our purpose? Is that our style? And that's what we need to do. I'll tell you, I had a happy experience, maybe because God wanted me to use it as an illustration, maybe because I've been conscious of it. But while I was sitting in a funeral on Saturday, first funeral, 2 in a row, back to back, the soloist was singing the Lord's Prayer. And she's a very powerful soloist. But you know, I heard the organ. And there's this guy sitting in the back of Memorial Chapel on a tiny little organ, you know, more like a home version than anything like this. And he was really wailing along. And he was accenting the song, and he was carrying it to a whole nother level. And I liked it so much that as we were passing by to look at the body, I snuck out of line. I went to the back. I'm a pastor. I know exactly where the organ is. And I said to the guy, that was splendid, outstanding. It really blessed me. And he looked over, and, you know, he was touched. He was still playing, but he took his hand off and, you know. So that's just kind of keeping the love always on the forefront. I'm going to end with this story. I was at a conference preaching, and after I did the sermon, one mom came up to me, and she talked to me about how she had really gone through a hard time with her teenage daughter. And they were fighting about her clothes, her schedule, her personal habits, the mess in her room, the fact that she closed the door and shut them out, and they would be fighting. And the relationship became more distant and more hostile, but, you know, she was a godly woman, and she prayed about it, and then suddenly she realized that she was no longer loving her daughter. She wanted her daughter to be a good daughter, but she forgot about how to do it in a loving way. So she started praying for God to help her to calm down and to try to restore the relationship. And over time, she started to learn to listen to her daughter and to hold her tongue or bite her tongue if necessary until more appropriate time that they could have real discussion. And by the time she talked to me, she and her daughter have found their first love. Okay? They had become best friends, and, they could talk about anything. You see? We can lose it. We can forget. That's why Paul is telling the Corinthians, you can get back on track. So I highly recommend, as we go into the holiday season, that you do an audit of all the important relationships in your life. And you say, hey, how am I doing? Is the way of love evident? Is the way of love still my primary purpose? Or have other wonderful, spectacular things sort of pushed it to the background? Okay?